Folks, happy Friday and welcome to the Freedom from the Press podcast. My name's Jason Robertson, and I'm here with my co-host.
Rise and shine, everybody. Todd Peterson coming to you a little bit early today as we kick off our Friday and weekend. Good to have you all with us today.
Folks, today we've got an interesting topic. Right now, we wanted to kind of salute some of our friends in Iowa. It's going to be the first Republican primary, and we thought, what better thing to do than let's talk about a topic that could be near and dear to our friends in Iowa. And kind of where this episode was spurned from is we look right now, there's this huge movement in the auto industry that government's interfering with the free market, and it's causing all sorts of disruption. So the executives are getting rich off of it. The workers are mad because the executives are getting rich off of it. But the con is the game only goes on as long as the government keeps funneling taxpayer money into this program. So we were looking at different examples of what, how could we explain this? How can we have the right historical data? And the ethanol story, it actually aligns perfectly with what's happening currently with the electric industry. And it'll give us some parallels, and it gives us a bigger data set so that we don't have to say what will happen and project out. We can actually look at what is happening in the ethanol subsidies. Todd, I know it's something near and dear to you. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, subsidies. So we've all heard the word here. I think as we're going through our program today, you have to understand that a subsidy is the government incentivizing business and industry to act in a certain way. And as we've talked before in the podcast here, oftentimes these government programs begin with good intentions. We did Social Security a couple of weeks ago. I think the best of intent back then when FDR was implementing that over about 100 years ago, that a lot of older folks did not have any retirement set up. And so he set out, as if we can give him the benefit of the doubt, to provide something for folks nearing retirement during the Great Depression. You could look at that the same way with subsidies. Maybe some good intentions to start out to maybe gear the industries toward a certain place. But at the end of the day, a subsidy is the government intervening in the free market. And then once government gets involved, as we have laid out week after week here, and as many of our viewers surely understand, once the government gets involved in the marketplace, things go awry.
Yeah, and I'm going to start, and I'm going to tell a little story of how I equated it to a friend of mine. And then we're going to go through our ethanol story, and hopefully this makes sense. So raise your hand, everybody, if you've ever gone to a McDonald's and you've participated in the garbage food that they have at McDonald's. So in a McDonald's, they have fryers, they cook burgers, and on their main menu, they kind of have their top 10 items. These are items that they're really well positioned to manufacture. They sell at a high enough rate, and they make enough margin on it that they make the standard menu. If you look at when they test something, they'll test a food product and they'll see, okay, can we produce it effective enough? Can we sell enough to make money on it? And can it be a profitable product? And if a test goes well, you'll find, boom, that item ends up on your regular McDonald's menu. That's how capitalism works. McDonald's is a capitalist enterprise. And I think everybody can kind of say, yeah, I remember when they tested that. Now it became a full menu item. Well, what happens in this world of subsidies is the government comes to McDonald's and says, you know what? We really want you to do fried chicken. You've got fryers. You sell chicken. We think you can do fried chicken. And so not just do they encourage McDonald's to do chicken, they give your McDonald's store a ton of money to start doing fried chicken. Now, McDonald's is looking at this going, okay, this is crazy. Like cooking chicken is different than cooking fries. We need a whole new, we need to find a manufacturer. We need to figure out best practices. We need to do all that. Are we going to sell enough chicken? But if the government's giving me a bunch of money, I'm going to start selling fried chicken. And so then your McDonald's store starts selling fried chicken. Doesn't really matter if they're making any money. Doesn't matter if it's a good thing. But at the end of the day, as long as you're getting the government money coming in, like you're going to keep selling chicken. The problem comes when you cut off the fried chicken subsidy to the McDonald's, and the McDonald's needs to actually sell their chicken profitably. All of a sudden, all those system issues they have come to light. All of a sudden, the store starts losing money, and it creates a collapse. We're going to see this in the auto industry, which is, we kind of touched on it last week. the government's going to these auto workers and they're saying, hey, switch to EVs. People don't realize we pumped $16.4 trillion in government grants and subsidies into auto manufacturers to get them to switch to electric. So these profits that they're showing right now, just back to the fried chicken example, they aren't real profits. They're profits only because taxpayers through the government are giving money to the auto workers. And you see reports coming out continuing and continuing that say nobody's buying EVs, we're shutting down production, that sort of thing. It's because they're not making any money. And the auto workers who are just seeing the profit numbers because their union's not educating them, they don't realize that their executives at these auto companies are selling them down the river, and this goes bad. And that's what we're going to talk about when we get into ethanol subsidies, because this is a case study you can look back on, because this has a long and rich history of the government interfering in a free market. They're telling McDonald's to sell fried chicken, which works great until you stop giving them money to sell fried chicken. So, Todd, where do we start our journey of ethanol subsidies?
Yeah, great analogy, by the way, with the auto industry, McDonald's. Greg Loudermilk, thanks for your participation here today. I'm not going to pop up your comment. As always, though, Jason and I interpret that quite liberally, and we hope that you're directing your energy towards big government as we expose, again, the massive cons that are taking place against regular taxpayers every single day here. Let's begin with a timeline here. Again, things don't just happen by chance. We didn't wake up today and say, oh my goodness, there's ethanol subsidies taking place, and it's a massive burden on the taxpayer, the environment, the corn industry. Is we're going to look at corn. When we talk about ethanol today, makes up over 94% of all ethanol production. So corn is the big industry in this regards here. So backing up to 1978 here, we popped up a timeline if you're following us live on Facebook here. I'll read through some of this if you're listening on audio later on. Energy Policy Act of 1978 was the first federal legislative ethanol subsidy, and so it allowed for a 40-cent tax exemption per gallon of ethanol. And we see this slowly increase. So that's under a Democrat administration. You can now have Reagan in 1982 increases the tax exemption to 50 cents. By 1990 and then through 2000, again, you have Republicans, Democrats in office. Doesn't really matter when it comes to the subsidies. They increase that to 54 cents. George W. Bush, though, gets a lot of credit for where we're at today, because under his administration moving forward, we have seen a massive spike in corn production specifically because there is so much financial incentive for farmers, for growers, big business essentially to step in and start mass producing corn. And we're going to see where all this corn ends up. Newsflash, hint, spoiler, it's not on your kitchen table. It's going to go to predominantly the auto industry and then some other sectors as well.
Yeah, and it's funny as you take this journey down the path where, potentially created with good intentions. How do we get cars to burn ethanol instead of gas? Is it better for the environment? All those sorts of factors. Good for the farmers if we can start producing ethanol. And so understand, in 1978, we were giving people your money, taxpayer money, to have them shift to this ethanol production. It's really, really pretty wild.
And, full disclaimer here, this is not a comment on farmers for growers. If I had some acreage in, let's say, the middle of Iowa, and I see this program step up, I might take advantage too. This is money that's going to come in. It's going to help my family. It's going to help my family farm. So this is nothing against the individual growers here. But what Jason and I are trying to get at is really how government intervention is skewing the system, and it's not truly reflective now of the marketplace specifically. So just want to get that out there too. This is nothing against anyone that's growing corn, making a living. You're doing what you got to do. And if the government's going to offer you money, I took a stimulus check in 2020. I'm not going to just turn down that money either.
Well, yeah, and that's what's interesting. We're both Minnesota boys. I grew up working on a farm, and so we love farmers, and we understand the importance that they play. And government got involved in a free market, and all of a sudden it's created a system where farmers can only be profitable if they're continued to be propped up. And all the efficiency stuff. Kevin added a great comment that was talking about fermenting corn. It makes more CO2. That's what we're going to talk about, and understand this is kind of an undergirding for kind of the EV conversion. If you're making that leap, we're picking the corn conversion because we have the data now, like we've seen it long enough.
And Kevin, I think your question segues nicely into this. So again, well, I'll say typically right wingers like you and myself, Jason, independent thinkers here, we're often criticized as being anti-environment. We're the climate deniers. Nothing could be further from the truth. You and I care very much about the climate. We live in a beautiful state, naturally beautiful. It's not politically beautiful. We have lakes. We have the outdoors. We love to go fishing. We have every reason to want to maintain our environment here. So that pejorative set aside here, it is really interesting when you start to look at the damage that this is doing to the environment. And again, as the government, Joe Biden right now talks about saving the environment, climate change is an existential threat. At the same time, when you look at ethanol subsidies, they're doing the exact harm that they pretend that you and I care so little about. I'm going to pop up a cartoon here. Facebook might ding us for this one, Kevin, but it really gets to your question about, the lie. You talked about CO2, but there's so much more involved when we talk about producing this ethanol, which is supposed to run cleaner, pollute less. But if you think about production from seed in the ground to extraction to production to getting it in your car here, there is a lot of environmental harm done in that process. When you think about the GMO seeds that they're using to the pesticides they're tossing on the plants, you talk about running equipment, processing it, that's all going to take some sort of fuel. The chemical process involved to produce ethanol, and then you see that you finally get your 10% ethanol, maybe an E85 into your vehicle. The last thing that happened there was anything that we could call environmentally friendly.
Yeah, it's funny because we were looking at this cartoon and this just in, folks, this will probably get us dinged on social media. So you start with the ground and you're putting GMO enhanced corn in it. You douse it with fertilizer, you douse it with pesticides. You're doing a ton of harm to the environment with that. And then you have these processing plants that are less efficient than oil processing plants and create more waste and more pollution, and drawing the comparison to electric vehicles. You know what, in 3-4 years we could do it today, but like I say, some will be projection. You can replace this cartoon with your open cobalt mine in Africa that's just destroying the ecology, and then the manufacturing of the batteries. It just came out that a state had to fire up coal plants to power their battery factories. So they're burning more coal to actually produce electricity just to manufacture. We haven't even got to the how we're going to charge it. And it's funny because in this corn instance, like we say, farmers weren't doing nothing wrong. We all respond to financial incentives, but this is just crazy at how they
Understand that the
structure it.
process behind that and the narrative that you're being told by the mainstream media is certainly not 100% true. We'll leave it at that for Facebook fact checkers to level those claims out a little bit more. Dennis Tolliver, thanks for following along here. Government officials do this stuff to try and control the people and to make money for their pockets. Common theme of the show right now here: how do politicians get wealthy, and then how does big business thrive? Well, it's in this case ethanol subsidies. A lot of money is involved here. A lot of people are getting rich. But Jason, when I go to the grocery store, corn isn't any cheaper for me.
Right. And I love corn. Give me some fresh from the cob. In Minnesota, we got the sweet corn trucks where you can drive by and just grab it. It's freshly harvested. But yeah, that's funny, Todd. Where does the corn go?
It's interesting you asked that. Let's not bury the lead here. I think perhaps if you listen to anything in this show today, I think these statistics alone are worth watching here. We hope you share the show with your family, your friends. Jason and I often encourage you to share this with people that might not necessarily get exposure to, if they want to label us right wing or alt right or however we get termed nowadays, MAGA. This information is good for everybody here. So just understand, and I'm going to read this verbatim here. This is a small clip from a larger article that we can share later on in the comments. Just a fraction of the corn grown today ends up on the American dinner table. You might ask, well, what percent is that? Well, about 40% of all corn grown today is used for ethanol. I'm going to repeat that. 40% of all corn grown today goes for ethanol production. 36% goes to animal feed. So right off the top, you got 76% of all corn grown in the United States not going to your kitchen table. Stanford professor Mark Jacobson warned in 2007 that ethanol conversion, however, enhances ozone-related health risk and mortality, asthma, and hospital visits. Kind of doubling down on that theme that all these things about promises of green, environment friendly is certainly not the case.
Well, and it's interesting too, because we kind of touched on it with the comment, but one of the things you'll learn from us is always follow the money, and the money leads you on the path of what happens. So if you do a deeper dive into this, you'll find the government gives money for corn production for ethanol. They do that to get votes. Regardless of like long term, what's the viability, what happens when the government quits funding subsidies, then what spot does that leave the farmers in? So rather than figuring out how do we run a actual profitable business, back to the McDonald's example, it's great. Like as long as the government's giving money to the corn folks, like they're good. Oh, great comment by Sharon. Now we know why the top billionaire millionaires are buying up thousands of acres of farmland. They're going to get control of the ethanol market by growing acres of corn. I'm sure they don't care if it's clean and good for the environment. Sharon, we love you. You are starting to see the game.
Yeah, and understand they probably don't want all that acreage to grow animals. This is a separate deep dive into some conspiracy theories, but they don't want you eating animal produce. And so, yep, it would make a lot of sense for them to buy up the farmland, plant that corn, enrich themselves. We're starting to see the game here. Thanks for your comment, Sharon. And then
Yeah.
Earl chimes in. He says the byproduct is given away to cattle ranches for feed for free. Interesting you say that, Earl, because as we look at the development of ethanol in the beginning here, that itself was actually a byproduct of corn syrup production. And so if you want to get into the history a little bit more here about ethanol, it's been around a long time. People have known about it. We're going to pop up a clip of an even farther back history in terms of how long we've had ethanol. But in the 1960s and 70s, when they started to realize that they could sweeten everything, fatten you up with corn syrup, and slowly that replaced natural sugar in a lot of foods, one of the byproducts of corn syrup production is ethanol. And so now you have large companies with an excess supply of something that there's really not a market for right now. And you start to see the nice, cozy connection of big business and lobbyists saying, look, politicians, I've got all this ethanol stored up. How can we use it? Flashback to our timeline here in 1978. How about we mandate its use in gasoline? And so now that's where your 10% comes when you fill up your car every time. You got 10% of corn in there.
Yeah, and it's interesting some of the conclusions people are reaching in the comments, and some of this stuff is starting to click for folks. Um as you take it down the path. So we live in Minnesota. One of our biggest employers in Minnesota, down in Austin, Minnesota, is Hormel Meats. And for those who, shout out to any of our listeners who happen to be down in the Austin, Minnesota area, or who might have worked at Hormel, or I think everybody's probably eaten a Hormel product at some point in their life. But it's funny, Todd. Do you know what the newsletter name is at Hormel?
Is it a play on word with spam?
Nope.
Is it not related to lunch meats at all?
Kinda. It's related to a pig.
Oinker?
It is actually called the Oink.
Oh, hey, how about
And
that? That was a shot in the dark.
The reason they call their newsletter the Oink is they joke that they use every part of the pig but the oink. So by using the oink for their company newsletter. So as Todd pointed out, when you take this manufacturing process, so they shift us out of pure natural sugar, which is, I mean, sugar's not the greatest for you, but compared to other sweeteners, million times better. Just like real butter is better than margarine. But
It's
they're left.
natural. We can at least start there. Yeah.
Yeah, we can start there. And then you're left with this byproduct, and these companies are trying to figure out, how do we monetize this byproduct? Because before they started giving ethanol subsidies, Todd, what did they do with it?
Well, they certainly didn't put it in your car.
Right. They just
I
got rid
think
of it.
it must have just sat there. Yep.
Yeah, for the most part. So yeah, and once again, we got a couple of folks that are always staying with ethanol. Hey, you know what, Phoebe? We want ethanol to work for the farmers. What we're trying to show you is how the government has set up a system where the only way ethanol works is if they continue to give money to farmers to produce it. But you're not the one that's really benefiting. The one that's benefiting are the politicians who are being back-ended money from the ethanol industry, and these big businesses who now have been able to take a waste product that they had no use for, and they're actually getting paid. So for the farmers, and I mean, this is a sad reality because many farmers who do corn couldn't do it without the ethanol subsidies. But while they're giving you nickels, they're stealing dollars.
Yeah, and I do want to comment on Phoebe. Beautiful picture, by the way. As Jason and I say, most Americans want to have a happy family. They want to go to work every day. They want to raise their kids, spend time in their community. I don't know your politics, Phoebe. That's immaterial to the larger point here. But as Jason and I go through ethanol this week, Social Security, the federal deficit in previous weeks, it's really just bringing information to folks so that they have a better understanding of what their government is doing, how much it is doing of that. And the consequences for both them, which are financially positive, and for you and I, which are mostly harmful in this sense. And so, as we said at the beginning, if you joined us a little bit later here, we are not against farmers in the least. We are really just about government getting involved here. And then to Jason's larger point, it's the third bullet point on here. If ethanol worked, the market would reward it. And so that gets back to the point of more subsidies in general. Why is government involved in the first place? You got to think about who's benefiting from that transaction. If this was something that truly worked, we truly needed, the marketplace would reward that. And right now, we don't see any marketplace rewarding anything. We see government getting involved and kind of dictating what happens.
Well, and it's interesting you say that too. So, back to my fried chicken example I had started with. So the government has created in that McDonald's example where that restaurant was dependent on the government for their future. Because if the government quit subsidizing their chicken, they would have destroyed their business model if they switched everything over to chicken because they couldn't do chicken right. That's why they weren't Kentucky Fried Chicken. If you think of what's happened to farmers, farmers are the backbone of this country, and farmers are some of the most independent, self-reliant people we know. I mean, I remember working on a farm as a kid. I worked on a dairy farm in the summers, and like the folks I worked with, the family, like we lived out there. It was so great. Like we had family dinners and it was fresh from the garden or freshly harvest, cow. And it was awesome. And it was what Americans should be. But what's indirectly happened, especially to corn farmers, if they have found a way to make you a government dependent, because if they quit doing subsidies for your ethanol, you are going to be in the same situation that we find a lot of folks in the inner city, where those inner city folks, if you cut off their public assistance, like they're done, right? And so they're almost 100% reliant in a lot of these towns on government assistance. They're backdoor doing that to our farmers, who are the most independent people in America. And it's really terrifying when you think about that. Because as soon as they shut off the government spigot of ethanol subsidies, if you've converted your entire production, your entire operation to corn, and you've bought the equipment and you've figured out all the systems for it, when the government money shuts down, you're just a dependent of the government. All of a sudden you're screwed. And this is what's going to happen to the auto workers. Right now, it's great. Let's give raises. Let's do 32-hour work weeks. Let's do all that. But when the government shuts the spigot down and they're no longer giving them money for electric vehicles, they're out of business.
Absolutely. And just to put some numbers on that comment too, Jason, I don't have the graphic in front of me, and I think I'm remembering correctly, but something about doubling the price of corn in the last decade or so, thanks to the massive influx of government subsidies into the corn production specifically. So you take away government subsidies, you cut the price of corn in half, you're looking at a huge fallout, especially for the individual farmers. They can't afford to go year to year without not growing their corn and selling it on the marketplace as is right now. Big business would survive. They would probably gobble up the rest of the little farms that are out there. But for just mom and pop that are farming their cornfields, they cannot take a 50% haircut.
And, and the farmer's sitting out there going like, well, the government doesn't write me a check. How am I different from that inner city person who's getting a check from the government and is relied on their money? Well, that's because the money is funneled to these companies that are converting your corn over into gas. And I'll let Todd kind of break that down.
Yeah, this graphic kind of segues perfectly with your comment there, Jason. So we talk about how does money changing hands here? So how does government say we're going to subsidize the ethanol industry by way of corn? How does that get into the farmers' pockets? Okay, so the farmers have their corn for sale. They go to the marketplace. They sell their corn, which has been inflated. But what's really happening here is that big business is getting the big breaks on this. They're getting their tax breaks. One study estimates that basically the current corn ethanol tax credit is costing taxpayers $4.18 per gallon. So extrapolate that out here. The article continues. It says this costs about almost $6 billion per year, leading to 1.4 billion gallons above what is even necessary right now. So 12.6 billion gallons required by law through one of those renewable fuel standard acts. So there's a massive incentive now for these people. They don't care. They're just going to go get their government monies and they're going to produce more than they need because why not? We're getting paid for it. But at the end of the day, that's you and me paying at the pump.
Yeah. So hopefully as we're laying this out, some of the dots are connecting, and Liz had a great comment. Government equals control, 100%. And hopefully you're starting to see the scam. So the farmer, they don't know they're being scammed. They just know I'm making X amount of money to produce corn, and I shift my whole production. I could be growing soybeans, I could be growing hemp, I could be growing cows, I could be growing anything. But no, I switch my whole production over to corn. And then the people buying my corn are getting kickbacks from the government, and they're getting rich off of this. They're buying so much corn, making so much ethanol, they're making more than they need. Why? Because the government's paying them. And when we say the government's paying them, the government, Todd, does the government have a job?
So the government is issuing money. That's not their money, though.
That's not their money. That's taxpayer money. So they're taking our taxpayer money, they're giving it to a big business, your ethanol producers, who are then supporting the farmer. The farmer has no clue they're getting scammed. They're just like, hey, this is great. And they push back like, hey, don't slow down these subsidies, that sort of thing. But this has been going on for several decades. If that industry should exist as it does, it wouldn't need subsidies. You've got through the startup phase, you've worked out the kinks. If this was a profitable business model, you would be doing it. Back to my McDonald's example. If for 3, 4, 5, 10 years, the government subsidizes McDonald's to make chicken and they can't be profitable making fried chicken, well, but they've converted their entire operation to chicken, they're solely dependent on the government. And as soon as the government shuts the spigot off, all of a sudden they have control. Your company is demolished. Go to the electric car companies. Back to that example. Electric cars are different to maintain. There's all the infrastructure problems too with electric cars. But if you're Ford and you're getting $4 billion to switch your production, your manufacturing in the form of grants, your bottom line profit looks great this year. But overall, you're building something that isn't profitable. So as soon as the government spigot shuts off, your company's gone. And all those things you fought for are dry up as well.
And Jason, let's analogize this back to politicians in DC. So maybe they don't turn off the spigot necessarily, but what happens if your labor is dependent or your decisions that you make are dependent on my money? Maybe I don't turn it off on you, but now if I have all the leverage, what can I do, right? So we've seen this play out in the last week with the House Speaker vote, where Matt Gaetz stood up and called out all of his Republican colleagues, by the way, not Democrats, but his GOP colleagues, and said, you are beholden to special interests and lobbyists. All of that money is dictating the decisions made by your representatives in Washington, D.C. Same deal could apply here as well. Yep, maybe they turn it off, crush little family farms, which certainly seems like the goal if you're a globalist. But at the same time, maybe they keep it on and then they just completely own you in the decisions you make.
Well, and it's funny, dovetailing into the Matt Gaetz thing. It was interesting. One of my favorite Matt Gaetz interviews, and I had tweeted out a clip of it about a week ago, and I had done it when he first was on. He was on Tim Pool's podcast, Timcast, which great show. I love watching Tim. And he does long form interviews, and he described what happened. And Tim just said, Matt Gaetz, why is it so bad? Like, how's it corrupt? And he said, let me walk you through. You're some rube, some average citizen out there. Let's use Iowa as an example, since we're talking corn in Iowa. You get elected to the House of Representatives to serve from Iowa. You show up on Monday to get ready for your first day in the House on Tuesday. Monday night, you get taken out to the fanciest steak dinner you've ever had with the best bottle of wine, and you're just some normal person who's used to going to the local diner, right? Then your first day you show up, the first thing you do is vote for the House Speaker. And you don't even know anybody. You don't know what's going on. You don't even know where the bathroom is. And they're like, okay, great. You voted for the House Speaker. Now let's prove the rules package. You haven't reviewed it. You haven't done anything. And then they said, awesome. So that's done in the morning. And then they sit down and they go, okay, you're from Iowa. So we're going to go to lunch. And at lunch, we're going to introduce you to the ag lobby. Let's meet the ethanol people. Let's meet the fertilizer people. Let's meet those folks. And the House leadership pairs you with your representatives from the lobby industry that is going to give you money. Those people take you out to lunch. Those people, you exchange business cards, and the relationship is settled in within your first day in the House of Representatives. So all of a sudden they start that pipeline where these lobbyists, and you know what? Sometimes the lobbyists give money to your campaign. Sometimes they take you out to dinner. Sometimes they say, hey, you've got somebody that needs a job. Why don't, we need an administrative assistant. We need this person. We need that person. Give us their name. We'll get them a job. And so it's not always direct, like, here's your money. But then ironically, those same House members, when it's the fertilizer manufacturers annual meeting and they have to get together and give a speech, guess who they're inviting and flying in and putting up in a 5-star hotel and paying, 20, 30, 50, $100,000 to give their speech. It's that same politician they met on their first day of Congress.
And the grift keeps on going. So, Jason, you and I will have to cover the House Speaker debate maybe in a future episode here, but lots to unpack with that comment there. I want to give Robin a shout out here. Thanks for following along, Robin. Too much government is a bad thing. Americans are compared to pigs in a fence. It's a perfect farm analogy for what we're talking about today here. Feed the pig, put up a panel, make them use the panel, keep feeding them, put up a second panel, and on and on and on here. Folks, we invite everyone to chime in here. What are your thoughts about corn ethanol subsidies right now? A lot of comments are extrapolating that and just saying government is bad, right? So we're taking the lessons here. We're focusing specifically on ethanol production and how the government has subsidized that and how it's spiraling out of control in terms of how they can control you, how the finances work here. But absolutely, this is just one small facet of how big government just steps in and crushes both the free market, individual freedom. So we'd love to hear your thoughts on all this.
Yeah, and Todd, I've got to
It's tinfoil hat time. What do you got, Jason?
Tinfoil hat time, because you touched on it. All right, so I'm going to go tinfoil hat. I apologize. It's full tinfoil hat too. So we have seen a large increase in the purchasing of farmland. Biggest owners of farmland in America right now. Who's that?
It starts with a B.
It rhymes with Hayes.
Starts...
Bill Gates, largest owner of farmland in America. Who continues buying up farmland?
My first guess was going to be rhymes with Ina, but I'm going to go back to rhymes with eights.
Well, Bill Gates, but you're right. Rhymes with Ina. China is buying up American farmland all over this country. Now, if you think about it, most farmers are the most independent people in America. If the government wants to control anybody, if you control the farmers and the food supply, like, game over, right? That's when countries really fall apart, is when they start messing with the food source. So right now, if you look at all that corn production and say, okay, all this is only propped up by the government. Bill Gates, one of the richest, and we'll have to do an episode on Bill Gates. We've done it on our Substack on the AmericanTribune.news, where we've explored some Bill Gates stuff. Truly an awful person, in my opinion. And he is not looking out for the best interests of humanity, I guess, to put it nicely and politically correct. But so if you look, you have all these independent people, Bill Gates, China, big corporations are buying up all this farmland. And then a lot of the small farmers, they're making it where the only way you can stay in business is indirectly through government subsidies. So the politicians are getting rich from the ethanol industry. The corporations that are manufacturing the ethanol are getting rich, and they're giving you enough of a drip feed where you can survive and you can feel compliant on them. As Todd mentioned earlier, when they slow that spigot, all they got to do is turn that dial. And you know what? China and Bill Gates can afford 2, 3 rough years. Your average farmer can't. Your average farmer is 1 year away from bankruptcy, as sad as that sounds. They're so leveraged, there's so little margin in it. So if the government, when we talk about government control, which is where my conspiracy theory hat comes from, the reliance of the family farmer indirectly on government money is really terrifies me, because at some point when they want to shut down the most independent population in America, they just turn that spigot and they can shut it down. And then we're all looking to Bill Gates and China for our food, which is terrifying.
And let's not forget, Jason, I believe it was in Australia. I don't know if this was fact checked or not. We always have to be careful what we say on Facebook, but I seem to recall legislation coming out that you can't have your own little garden in your house at some point. That was during the pandemic there. So take away big farms, take away the individual farmer, take away your right to even have a garden on your own private property, and suddenly you are completely dependent on government to feed you here. And that brings up a comment from Timothy. Thanks for following along, Timothy. He says, it's obscene that we grow any crop for dubious results when anyone on the planet goes hungry. This is a big criticism. As we were researching the show here, I ended up on a lot of what I'll say were left-wing sites. One was called treehugger.com, so I don't know if it gets any more left-wing than that. But one of the main criticisms of this program, the ethanol subsidies, was just this point right here, right? Like, we are putting fuel, for lack of a better word, in vehicles when that very same product, the corn, could be used to feed hungry people around the world. Now, Americans have been largely sheltered from want, need, privation. We have it pretty good here, all things considered. We rail about the government every week, and things can always get better. But by and large, compared to what the rest of the world experiences on a daily basis, we're pretty comfortable. I woke up, I brewed my coffee, I had my breakfast, had heat in my house this morning because suddenly it dipped into 40 degrees here in Minnesota. We don't know a lot of these things that a lot of people go through. But when you talk about sending 40% of corn production to ethanol, 36 more going to animal feed, that's very little corn going to feed hungry people. And that's a big concern. And again, if you want to put your tinfoil hat back on, Jason, is it by design? Is it happenstance? But when we know for sure here, and there's another comment down here, talking to want to reduce global population, this one coming from Liz. You know what? You can only have so many dots before they just get connected automatically here. So when we move corn away from feeding people, we know that the mission is to reduce the global population. A lot of it fits really conveniently.
Yeah, and it's funny. A few people were asking for the links. So just to give a little bit about us, and Todd had mentioned it earlier. So the name of our podcast is called Freedom from the Press. The reason why we do what we do, Todd and I are just normal guys from Minnesota. Todd used to work in the education industry. I used to work in actually retail. And we saw what the media is doing to the country. And by the lack of true information that gets out, the politicization of everything, right and left just fight each other, and nobody realizes we're all getting screwed. And so we started the AmericanTribune.com. Full disclosure, that's our fun website. We post goofy articles about culture. We post things about, we do a little bit of religious stuff on there, mainly when it's like political figures talking about their religion, or people in the entertainment industry talk about sports, that kind of thing. So I'll say that's kind of our politically correct website. What we try to do is put out 10, 15 articles a day that a conservative would want to read, or a free thinker would want to read. We also have the AmericanTribune.news, and the AmericanTribune.news is our Substack. And what that is because that's not monetized, that's not run through big sex. Substack's a great platform. Like this week, Will, one of our partners, wrote a great piece about how they're lying about inflation, and how that came about is, I don't know if you guys have gone to the grocery store lately. Like my wife Jen and I, we go every 2 weeks, and we buy kind of the same stuff, right? Like we buy Jiffy peanut butter, we get bread, eggs, milk. Our diet's not super varied, right? Where you kind of get your 20 things that you cook or whatnot. And we've noticed that our grocery bill that used to be about $200 for a couple weeks is now like $350. But yet the government tells me inflation's not that bad, and they're giving us these percentages. So Will did a great piece on how they're lying to you about inflation. And it was funny that the thing that really stuck out to me is like used cars. If you've gone to price out a used car lately, it's like 5 times what it used to be. I mean, used car that used to be like $5,000. Now the average used car price is like $15,000. The government doesn't even figure that in inflation. It just blows my mind away because they're saying, well, that car is a much better car than you used to buy. So even though the average price of a used car that you can buy costs 3 times as much, that's not inflation. Another example is like we buy Jiffy peanut butter. Jiffy peanut butter used to be $5 for a jar. Now it's $9 for a jar. But they don't count that as inflation because you can still buy a jar of peanut butter for $5. You got to be okay getting the generic instead of Jiffy, but you got to be okay with that. So part of our mission, and we appreciate people listening and commenting, support our work. Go to our website, read our stuff, give us feedback. Consider subscribing to the Substack. That work is a little more deeper dive. That's kind of the same thing that we do on the podcast. And like Todd mentioned, we'll really ask you if you want to do nothing else. If you listen to this, you're 40 minutes in, you're like, these guys, I like what they said. Give it a share. And that helps us get word out. And I would encourage you to share it with somebody who you might not politically agree with. And my best friend, he's a liberal. He voted for Joe Biden. And it's funny because when him and I talk, he'll ask me about something going on in the news. He'll be like, okay, so what's the real story? And I'll give him the breakdown. Like, this isn't what Fox News says. We hate Fox News too. And this is just what the real information is. So
Yeah, speaking of Fox News, and I want to get back to a comment from Tammy here because that's quite on point and not something I had considered here. But I don't know if you saw the recent interview with one of the representatives, Tim Burchett, who voted to oust Kevin McCarthy here. Find that clip. It's about 2 or 3 minutes long on the internet there. But man, you can watch some of these Fox anchors completely expose themselves. If you watched Fox News because Tucker was on there or there's someone else you like on there, but just be warned, if you're watching Fox News, you are not getting right-wing information. I want to pop up this comment, Jason, coming back to our ethanol conversation. Tammy says that Illinois grows seed, feed, and ethanol corn that's not even fit for human consumption. All right, maybe I'm misinterpreting that. Maybe it's all grown and it's not intended for humans necessarily. But that's an angle I hadn't considered as well. At some point, do you grow something that's not even, it has zero nutrients for humans? It's been completely bled dry of anything that would make corn worth eating for people. I wouldn't put that out of the realm of possibility either, to see that eventually they just grow these crops that, not even intended for people, but not even meant for people at a certain point too.
Yeah, and it's interesting when you talk about that the speaker situation, because we're filming this right in the middle of it. Trump came out and endorsed Jim Jordan. The speaker battle, pay attention, folks. And this is hard for somebody who's identified as part of the Republican Party for a while. I grew up with conservative values, and it was funny when I was young. I actually voted for more Democrats and Republicans because I saw the corruption in the Republican Party. And I'm like, I hated the Bushes because they just wanted to go blow something up, right? And then work with the military industrial complex. So Democrats were always like, I always thought, well, they're stupid and they have bad policies, but at least they're less corrupt. Now the Democrats are just as corrupt as Republicans, which our friends on the Democrat side aren't. Oh yeah, Charles. Jim Jordan is an excellent president. We'll get to that, Charles. But anyway, so now on the Republican side, folks, everyday average Americans like you and me and Todd and many of you guys watching, the Republican Party is not on your side. And you'll see all these people speaking out against Matt Gaetz. Matt Gaetz, he wants a balanced budget. He wants transparency. He wants you to actually vote on bills. Like, most people don't realize we collect $4 trillion in taxes and we're going to spend $6 trillion this year. Insane. If anybody watching the show said you're going to go spend 30% more money than you take in and you think that ends well, you're an idiot. You know what I mean? But yet all these people in government do that. And tying back to the ethanol subsidies, they're going to give billions to the ethanol industry. There a little bit's going to trickle down to the farmers to keep them, to keep them viable. The organizations are going to get rich, and then politicians get rich from those organizations. Meanwhile, the taxpayers continue to get screwed.
Yeah, and Jason, I love having a live show because it takes us in all different directions here. So you talked about Matt Gaetz a little bit, and I think this is worth showing too because oftentimes we only hear our side. I'll say our pretty generously because the Republicans are certainly not on our side. Matt Gaetz supported Ro Khanna, who is not a conservative in the least. He's a Democrat representative from California here, but those two have at least partnered up on Twitter. Ro Khanna came out a couple of weeks ago saying we needed term limits, so he proposed 12 years. He proposed some of the same things that Matt Gaetz is saying. So an interesting dynamic playing out right now is some Republicans and some Democrats are open to the idea of making some meaningful change here. And again, when we talk about politicians actually doing something good, I'm not going to hold my breath for that. But there's some good conversations taking place where the Democrats and Republicans who are breaking from their party narratives are proposing things that you and I, Jason, our viewers have said for a long time here. Balanced budget, term limits, do things that are going to root out the corruption in DC. So good things happening here. We'll definitely circle back to that House debate next week.
Oh my gosh! And Jim had a great comment, dude. Dude, how are you going to manage the budget on the effing $32 trillion in debt? Give me a break. Here's what's interesting. Actually, last week's episode, Jim, it's available on the Facebook page you're watching this on, or YouTube channel, or Rumble channel that are under the American Tribune. But for the budget, like, people got to realize how bad the budget is. Like, we're up to almost it's actually not 32 trillion, it's 33.4 trillion. To put in perspective how awful the Republican Party is, Kevin McCarthy on August 1st, if you all remember the debt ceiling and like, oh, they're going to shut the government down, oh, everything's going to blow up, he approved an unlimited debt ceiling. So we took off the credit limit on the government credit card. And since then, we were just under 31 trillion. We're now at 33.5 trillion. I think it's 33.6 trillion. It's sad. I actually check it most every day.
And
And
Jason, we ran up $300 billion just yesterday. That's how out of control this is getting. So we talk about 33. If you watch this show in a week from now, we're going to be outdated. It's going to be 34 and a half.
it's funny because I do a podcast during the week on Wayne Dupree. If you've ever heard of him, Wayne Dupree Show, great podcast. Love doing it with them. And it was funny because when they removed the debt ceiling, and we speak out against the establishment Republican Party on that show too. I remember I was ranting on. I'm like, this is stupid. I can't believe they do that. And how did McCarthy let this cave? And we we're like, just with our budget, we're going to spend $4 trillion. So by the time the election comes up and the debt ceiling could be put back, we're going to be over 35 trillion. That's just what the number is, what the budgets are. And I said, to be honest, I think we're going to be pushing 36 to 40 trillion. 100%. Like they're just going to keep overspending the budget, rah rah. And I remember I got called out by some prominent conservatives for being a conspiracy theorist, or like, why are you so alarmist? And it's funny because the projection when he signed that deal was 35 trillion, because that would have been 4 trillion more than the 31. We're already we'll be by the end of the year, we'll be up over 34 trillion. So
Well,
we'll be
Jason, you
staring.
and I did the federal deficit. Was that last week or 2 weeks ago here? Going back to Jim's comment too about what are you going to do with 32 trillion? Remember, they're projecting $89 trillion by the end of the decade. This train is not slowing down. And Jim, we had some pretty alarming, pretty grave conclusions / predictions about where this goes. You're right. You're not going to balance a budget when you have that much debt, when basically all the tax revenue you take in just goes to the interest on your debt. You're looking at a big problem here. So you either raise taxes, the Fed continues to raise rates, which if you start reading about that they're saying double digits again shortly. That only makes it more unsustainable too, because now the government, when they issue new bonds, is going to be paying a higher premium. And guess what? That's only going to make the interest payments higher too. So yeah, it's a good question, Jim. Not a great answer here, unfortunately.
Right. Well, and I mean, here's what's scary, folks. We pay more interest on the credit card on the national debt than we pay on defense. And for those of you with kids, or those of you with grandkids, we have totally screwed those folks over. like in addition to not being able to buy a house, in addition to not being able to, find jobs or, some of those things. And don't get me wrong, the younger generation has some work to do on their own as well. But we are saddling them with, I mean, but I'm by the election probably $40 trillion, which is just horrifying. So, Todd, what else do we need to go through in ethanol? Sorry, we got into a little bit of a dovetail there.
Yeah, no, that works well. Love the comments here. I think some of our viewers took us in a different direction, and that's awesome. We love your engagement and participation. Want to continue to see those comments roll in here. Like, share if you're enjoying the conversation so far. We can back it up one more time here to ethanol. This is really just as a historical aside. This doesn't really add anything to the con of big government or anything. And I apologize that it's really small here. This is how screenshots work sometime. I didn't know this necessarily coming into the conversation here. It makes sense now that we have it. Initially, we had talked about how ethanol was a byproduct of making corn syrup in the 60s when they started to develop that. Now, all of a sudden, you have ethanol. Here comes the lobbyist saying, what can we do with our excess ethanol? Well, government's going to help us and put it in your gasoline. But this has been around for a long time here. And so in 1826, we're going back to, it was first used to power internal combustion engines, which is fascinating. Rockefeller, big oil comes out at the turn of the century there. But decades before they decided on oil, and I think decided is a good word here because certainly people had an invested interest in promoting oil. But ethanol was used in combustion engines when those first came out. And then in the early 1900s, it says Henry Ford produced the first, what we now call a flex fuel Model T. He was using ethanol, cheap ethanol, to power his early models there out of Ford. Really interesting stuff. And again, if you want to put on that conspiracy hat, Jason, how did we end up using oil if we knew about this and certainly other lost technologies, or at least buried technologies that could be used as alternative fuel sources?
It's funny. I love that slide because it kind of brings our conversation full circle where we started talking about the EV conversion. And as you can see, ethanol's been around forever. And it wasn't the most efficient fuel. It wasn't the most profitable fuel. The free market. Now, there was government intervention by big oil. Don't get me wrong. Big oil is not clean on this. But the market chose oil and just regular production oil when ethanol was an available technology. And now you can see what's happened is you've created this infrastructure that's being supported by government taxpayers where politicians make money off it, corporations make money off it, and indirectly it's established control over our farmers because they're reliant on that money. Fun fact, there were actually electric cars in America back around the same time. Many major cities, their subway system was electric. There was electric vehicles. But the market said the way to go is gas. I use the example of beta and VHS for VCRs, for those of us who are old enough to remember that. There was beta technology, there was VHS technology. Actually, beta was better. It just wasn't as marketable. So that's how I ended up with that.
Yeah, and government didn't get involved and say everyone needs to get a beta.
Exactly. All right,
Awesome.
Todd.
Well,
any other thoughts?
I think we were both going to close it up here. Yeah. Any final thoughts here? I was reading through some comments here. I think we've summarized nicely what we wanted to get through today. Folks, I'll just say it one more time. If you've enjoyed the show here, we're here every Friday. But if you liked what you heard today, like, share, comment. And as we like to say often, share this with folks that might not necessarily be exposed to some other ideas out there that are outside the mainstream press.
Yeah. And I guess just kind of my last thoughts thanks for tuning in. Great engagement. Todd and I do this, feel free to support our work. Click our website, share stuff, watch the video on YouTube so we make a little money. Subscribe to our Substack. That helps support the work we do. But most importantly, we do this because if we can just reach 1, 2, 3, 10, 100 people and have them go, holy cow, I didn't realize how bad I was being scammed. That's what's going to help save this country. And the country is being run by corrupt people who have the support of the media to run interference for them. And content like this is going to helpfully break that narrative. So you can realize that when you take the politics aside, you take the spin aside, and you just look at the facts, they're damaging our country. And we need to stop and take it back before we lose it.
All right. Well, thanks as always for watching. Everyone have a safe and wonderful weekend. We'll catch you next Friday.